Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. If my issue with the last video was that talking about Spider-Verse was hard for just how freaking amazing and universally adored it was, then Far From Home is a completely different animal in that it's remarkably divisive. Other YouTubers who I'm friends with or respect really don't like this one, while others still acknowledge it as a great Spidey flick. Granted, I've talked about far more divisive films. You're looking at the #1 Last Jedi stan this side of the universe, and people who keep up with my Doctor Who content can tell you all the controversial opinions I've had regarding that show, and some of its more widely despised episodes. But the people who don't care for Far From Home really don't like it. Part of why it feels bad is that I can't quite champion this movie the same way I would Last Jedi or even something like Captain Marvel. Far From Home is a movie with problems. Big ones. It's a movie that feels caught between two diametrically opposed visions of the character and two thematic and tonal approaches to his world. Far From Home takes a lot of what worked in Spider-Man Homecoming and steroids it up until they threaten to be more weakness than strength, and chief among these things is the comedy. Homecoming makes an explicit Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference, and the sort of heightened comic personalities of Peter's circle lent to that film a tone reminiscent of high school comedies of that era. Far From Home ups the goofiness to an extreme, and its gags are super hit and miss. Some of the stuff that is actually funny lands well and it makes me laugh pretty hard. A lot of the physical slapstick regarding Peter and his fight scenes isn't a problem for me. I don't even mind the stuff like the In Memoriam gag. Really, the problem there is just the use of stock images, but pretty much everything with the teachers is utterly cringeworthy. I don't think there's a single comedic bit with JB Smoove and Martin Starr that lands, which sucks because those are funny guys. It's a particular shame because if you wanted to play Starr's character for even the slightest, tiniest bit of actual pathos, it would be super impactful. Remember back in Homecoming where we made a joke out of how this guy had had a student die on a field trip before, and then most of the characters in this film were confirmed to be disintegrated while he himself was not? If we had even just a couple lines about how that affected this guy, he'd go from a dumb, pathetic joke machine to an actual human-feeling character. Not only do the punchlines not land as often, but the comedic dialogue and situations often feel forced. The biggest synthesis of this is the infamous drone sequence on the bus. Now, I don't hate the actual sequence on the bus itself, at least not nearly as much as other people do. Where it loses me is with the stupid baby mountain goat thing, where everyone else in that bus becomes a cartoon character for 5 seconds. But prior to that point, I think this scene is actually a really good example of escalating tension in a comedic context. The laughs increase in tandem with the situation getting more and more chaotic, and in part it's nervous laughter because Peter is actually in a tough spot. It reminds me of a less dramatic version of the Washington Monument sequence in the first film, Peter being the only one in the know to the actual danger he himself put his classmates in as the situation builds and builds and builds to a sudden release of tension. It's also an engaging, action-driven form of exposition, letting the audience know about the drones without just info-dumping at them. Unfortunately, the final gag really does push it too far into nonsense territory. God, I miss Hannibal Buress. This movie does have pathos, and it does work when it decides to show up, but the choice to use it so sparingly with the supporting characters in particular is a major downfall, in that it seems like the movie just doesn't take anyone seriously who's not in a costume. Or MJ, but we'll get to that. It makes the world feel less human than that of the other films, and no one suffers this more than Aunt May, who is the single least redeemable element of this film to me. May got pretty limited screen time in Homecoming, but with what she was given to work with, she was so good in that movie. You got the sense that she was a woman who's fun and cool, but also hurt and incredibly protective of Peter to the point that she'd need a real push to accept that him being Spider-Man was something to get behind. Why did Far From Home do her so dirty? Why is Aunt May in this movie so pithy? Why is there nothing going on with her? Why is she suddenly unconcerned and supportive of her surrogate son putting his life on the line, especially after he was directly involved in an incident in which they both did die? Why isn't she on the field trip? I swear, if I could go back and make one change to this movie in the writing stages, this would be it. Let May Parker be an actual character and take some screen time to explore how Spider-Man affects her and Peter's relationship by having her be a chaperone on the science trip. It'd make perfect sense with the character, it'd flesh her out, I'm sure it would make for some great comedy as well. It's a decision I think would have bolstered this movie a lot. That the film is so completely dismissive of her is a giant point against it, and worst of all, retroactively sucks the wind out of the sails of Homecoming's game-changing cliffhanger. In tandem with the overly jovial and shallow portrayal of its supporting cast, the other big conceptual issue most have with Far From Home is the continued imposition of other MCU elements. Far From Home really got the raw end of the deal by having to serve as an endgame epilogue. Much like Homecoming, the wider universe aspect is great when it's popping up in little ways. That list of in-flight documentaries we see for like 5 seconds is a great, quick little bit of world building, and the way that not just Iron Man but quote-unquote superhero culture at large informs Mysterio's methodology is really interesting in ways we'll get to in just a bit. The real issue here is Nick Fury, Talos borrowing Nick Fury's likeness. Fury's presence in the grand scheme of this movie feels like it's just there to lend Mysterio's gambit some kind of legitimacy, or alternatively to use the MCU's quintessential stern dad for superheroes to pile the pressure and sense of inadequacy on Peter. Which, fair enough, those are understandable purposes, but fake Fury's presence here feels real obligatory. It's kinda cute that we've got Skrulls pretending to be major characters in this movie all about fakery, illusions, and hiding the truth, but you could remove fake Fury and Hill from this film without much retooling beyond basic plot points, and I don't think you'd lose anything too substantial for it. So yeah, this movie has a lot of flaws. Like a lot. Tonally, thematically, even a little bit visually. I've given it a lot of guff, so I'm gonna have to have some pretty big positives if I'm gonna justify still wholeheartedly enjoying this film and never even hesitating to rewatch it. And luckily enough, the two biggest things about the movie that really make it work are, I'd argue, the two most important things in the piece: our hero and our villain. To talk in depth about Peter Parker's arc in this movie, I'm gonna have to tackle something that I've already skirted around enough. In more ways than one, a make-or-break aspect of this movie for many people is the involvement of Tony Stark, or Tony Stark's ghost, and the decision to focus so much of Peter's arc around him. For detractors of this movie, having Peter be so fixated on Tony's death feels like a betrayal. It feels like sacrificing this movie's place as a Spider-Man film, corrupting Peter's arc of responsibility, for the sake of elevating another character whose presence has already defined too much of Peter's place in this universe. This is something that kinda bothered me for the longest time after seeing this movie, and a lot of it pivots around the scene in the plane. The scene in the jet. Coming off of Homecoming especially, it's easy to see this whole bit as thematically mixed signals. Happy claims Peter is never going to be Iron Man, and that's okay, while Peter building yet another suit out of Stark tech, Happy putting on Back in Black, hell, Happy's whole presence as a supporting character in Peter's story suggests that Peter is firmly stuck in Tony's shadow. A lot of people read that into that scene, and I don't blame them, though I see things differently. Peter's arc is maybe muddled by that sequence if the idea is supposed to be he's not Tony Stark and never should be, but I don't quite think that's what we have here. I think the real idea underlining this whole conversation is that Peter's putting too much undue pressure on himself to be perfect in a way that Tony Stark never was. That bit about this being Tony's ghost rather than Tony the actual man is important, because it ties into this movie's central motif about lies and illusions, specifically lies and illusions that Peter is telling himself. Peter's journey involves getting over his incredibly skewed vision of Tony in his head, this illusion that he and the rest of the world have built up posthumously of a guy who had it all figured out and could do no wrong, of a martyr who saved literally the whole planet. Peter learns what we as viewers have always known, that Tony was just a guy. A guy who screwed up harder than Peter ever has, and when Happy puts on AC/DC only for Peter to shout out how he loves Led Zeppelin, it's a sign that while Peter and Tony are similar, they are still distinct, and what Peter needs to take from Tony's example isn't any of the surface-level traits or gimmicks, but that it's okay to screw up, make mistakes, and to be human so long as you bounce back. There's also the subject of EDITH, and the more than potentially problematic way it makes an otherwise innocuous movie into a commentary on drone warfare. I don't actually think EDITH's existence or its bequeathment to Peter reflects all that badly on Tony's character, as so many others seem to. For one, we have to assume from inference that Tony developed EDITH prior to Infinity War, which would be perfectly in character for that period of his life. We also have to assume that he hoped to live long enough to see Peter outgrow his teens when he first had the plan to bequeath them to him. Yes, it does kind of suck that we're getting this movie after Endgame, where Tony finally realized his arc about needing to slow down and relax, and yet here we find out that at some point he developed something that was only a couple of steps removed from another Ultron. And while I'm not sure how the movie could make this clear in dialogue in order to cover its own bases, I think what we can infer doesn't undermine that arc too much. What EDITH is a great symbol of responsibility throughout the film, and why Peter's arc is, I think, still quintessentially Spider-Man, despite all of these very odd trappings. If there's one thing I don't think you could competently dispute about Peter's arc in this film, it's that it's very much built on the power-responsibility dichotomy. How Peter's choice to give the glasses to Beck and his eventual acceptance of them as his own represent in clear and simple terms the internal conflict between wanting to be responsible and wanting to live a life apart from Spider-Man and hero business and Tony's legacy and all that pressure. Think of EDITH in this film like Peter's powers in Spider-Man 2. The moment he loses them is the moment he thinks he can start living his own fulfilling life, only for them to later realize, both tragically and triumphantly, that he can't have it that easy. Peter is put in a position where, after the trauma of dying, coming back, and losing another mentor, he needs to be reminded of his central philosophy. That by choosing or even thinking to pawn off the EDITH glasses and the job of superhero onto someone else, he's choosing to do nothing, ostensibly. And while you could certainly argue that there are toxic aspects to Peter's if you do nothing and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you philosophy, or just the approach that Spider-Man media has had toward great power and great responsibility since its inception, in this case it very much is an instance where the bad things happen and it is Peter's own fault and his mess to clean up. Peter doesn't need to be the quote-unquote big man to take that responsibility and be a hero. Another thing I don't think can be disputed, for as much as it might potentially symbolically conflict with what I just said, is that EDITH needs to be destroyed. Or put away. Point is, we need to see a scene dedicated to Peter recognizing how dangerous it is and doing away with it. Peter accepting responsibility by embracing his ownership of EDITH instead of trying to pawn it off is good. Peter realizing that no one should have that kind of power is better. It's the big punctuation mark I think was needed to totally excuse EDITH's presence in this movie, and the thing that would have taken Peter's arc from good to great. I'm not gonna lie, I won't be remotely shocked if the EDITH glasses just don't come up in the next movie. That will ultimately be for the best, because even just in practical terms, Peter Parker having access to an army of drones would make things way too easy for his character going forward, but I wish I didn't have to expect that coming as some kind of cop-out. Small nitpick, Spider-Man shouldn't still have a hard time speaking in front of a crowd. That whole opening scene with May and the charity, that's a weird beat. Having him actually able to work the crowd at first would make the bit moments later where he basically has a panic attack and splits that much more impactful. I think this movie is really missing something with the absence of the fight scene with the mob that got cut. Without it, the first action scene, the arrival of the water elemental, occurs at exactly the 20-minute mark of the movie, and that's where things start to really pick up. Not only would the restaurant fight have been a neat bit of classic Spidey action earlier in the movie, but it accomplishes a lot that strengthens this stretch of the film. It shows us a Peter who's in his element, who breezes through the same kind of illegal weapons deals that he massively screwed up in his previous movie, this time with skill and confidence. I'm still not in love with the Iron Spider suit as the thing Peter just goes around fighting crime in, but in his handling of the criminals and his back and forth with the police, we see the Spider-Man persona fully formed and comfortable for the first time in the series. With so much of the film being about Peter's apprehension toward the legacy left behind for him, it's good to see the part of the job that he enjoys and excels at this early on. In the charity scene, he feels like Peter Parker in a costume. In this scene, he feels like Spider-Man. This is also the most expressive we see Peter's mask get across the movie, which you know I love. That said, speaking of the outfit, the Spidey suit that we end this film on is probably my favorite in any of these movies. At the time of this recording anyway, these are all really good suits and I'm really fickle. Case in point, it took me a while to come to this conclusion, but it just looks so sleek while still being recognizably Spider-Man. I really hope it's the outfit the next movie sticks with, as if this Spider-Man was missing anything, it was visual consistency. Let the man just have one outfit for a movie, guys. Relax, how many toys do you need to sell? Jeez! Overall, I feel like if Far From Home accomplishes anything, it's successfully making us empathize with Peter and putting us in his head. When I watch this movie, I always feel for the guy. The things he cares about become things I care about, and I want to see him overcome his pressures and insecurities. One extremely underappreciated bit of this film that I love is after Peter talks with Ned about the need to keep his classmates safe. The way Fury's voice overlaps the scene transition with the sharp cut as Peter turns his head tells you all you need to know, re Peter basically having been stuck in that moment of mounting concern and stress until jolted out of it. It's the kind of using film editing and structure to put you in the character's POV kind of move that not a lot of other MCU movies use. But hey, I mentioned our hero and our villain, and basically every part of this movie that works hinges in some way, directly or otherwise, on Mysterio. This movie does as good a job as Homecoming at patterning the themes and character arcs around the central motif of the villain. The same way not nearly enough people, by which I mean no one except me and full-fat videos, talk about how Homecoming does a great, subtle job of playing into how old Vulture is and how that central quirk of the character contrasts Peter's own youthful inexperience and lack of perspective, Far From Home takes advantage of Mysterio by making itself a story all about illusions. Quentin Beck, whose name isn't actually Quentin Beck, continues the streak of strong villains in Spidey movies and what's been a fairly consistent run of compelling MCU villains since its predecessor, the Vulture. With that said, Mysterio contrasts Vulture in all the best ways. Vulture was an under-the-radar grifter who, beyond spending most of the movie having to adjust and improvise around Peter's presence, didn't bear the kid too much ill will, was just a pain in his side. Beck, however, is outright preying on Pete, and a lot of his menace comes from the fact that he's basically controlling the movie around him from the word go. For the first two-thirds of the film, Mysterio dictates how every scene he's in plays out to a T, and that's a really interesting dynamic. He's a true sociopath, and with all the kindness and warmth he'd shown in the first half of the film feeling incredibly cruel in retrospect. Even his adoption of the name Mysterio is a calculated move to endear himself to Peter, taking the name given to him by Peter's friends in stride as one of the many ways he bolsters Peter's wavering confidence. The whole relationship between the two of them is just so sad on Peter's end. The crux of his problems through the movie are a feeling of relative inadequacy, that he's not good enough. To have someone like Beck make a show of being a supportive guy, someone who treats Peter with respect like an equal and peer, only to grind his insecurities into his face and then repeatedly try to kill him, it's the most personally antagonistic a Spider villain has felt since Osborn. Either of them. In keeping with Beck's comic origins as a former Hollywood alum, I like that he and his plan are used to comment on Hollywood productions. Far From Home takes advantage of Jake Gyllenhaal's manic, egotistical delivery and Mysterio's built-in penchant for effects and staging to make the villain plot into a sly indictment of superhero movie tropes. The tragic backstories, the faceless abstract monster villains we sometimes get, and in the third act especially, the ever-increasing, almost unsustainable scale that threats in these movies balloon to the point of using the same terminology that fans use of an Avengers-level threat. I love that for as big as the spectacle is here, Far From Home is key to point out that underneath all that, what Peter is fighting is really just another dude with some cronies, same as he was in Homecoming. The way Beck and Peter contrast each other is also great. While the relationship between Peter and Toomes was defined more by the generational gap, Beck and Peter are actually very similar, in a way that Beck spots and manipulates. The big difference, of course, is that Peter actively wants to scale down his life, and Beck is a raging egomaniac who wants gratification on the highest stage possible. We can see this part of Beck slip through even under the persona of his initial scenes, in a character beat I really like. Peter and Mysterio team up to stop the water elemental, and while a victorious and pristine Mysterio soaks up the praise before he flies off, Peter stands haggard and unacknowledged, happy with the small victory that at least the necklace he got for MJ is still in one piece. That little bit is just such a great encapsulation of these two as foils and their diametrically opposed priorities. When I say that Peter and Beck are the two big things about the movie that work, I don't want to make it sound like they're the film's only saving graces. Other things the movie emphatically has going for it from my perspective are other key fixtures of Spider-Man stories, the action and the romance. Peter and MJ in this movie are so gosh darn adorable. Not just that, but their relationship ties into the film's major motif of truth. Just like with Mysterio himself, lies and covers that characters put on for each other and themselves, hiding and obscuring the truth, pop up all throughout the movie. That's what lends some actual thematic relevance to the presence of Brad. He's not just an obstacle for MJ's affections arbitrarily. He's a guy who, regardless of if it means antagonizing Peter, is all about exposing MJ to the truth. Brad dislikes Peter because, despite apparently liking her, Brad sees Peter lie or hide the truth from MJ a lot. Every instance of Brad getting on Peter's case involves Peter trying to hide something from MJ or outright lying to her face. MJ herself, for a character who, in her own words, is obsessed with telling the truth, keeps her own personal truth hidden in the form of her feelings for Peter. Zendaya does a great job playing MJ as someone who's really only her real self around Peter, and is putting on a show for everyone else. This is best displayed in the scene with her and Peter in the hotel room. MJ is totally flustered by her suspicions about Peter's identity being proven true by the discovery of the mess they're in, and a heaping helping of teenage hormones. She's almost compelled to let all her walls down around Peter, then enters Ned, and the aloof exterior is right back up like nothing happened. When the walls all come down again is at the climax, where we see that insecurity that's been teased in MJ all throughout her interactions with Peter, along with just the slightest tease of where that comes from. I expect the third movie in the series will be as packed as this one, if not more so, but even then I hope we finally get a fuller picture of why MJ has had such bad luck getting close to people, and has her whole aloof persona in the first place. One of the few comedic beats in the earliest parts of the movie that I really like is the bow discussion. At this stage I know people are going to say I'm officially reading too much into it, but look at the name of the channel, people, I can't help where my mind goes. This is the first real, comfortable discussion between Peter and MJ in the film, and it highlights the neat kind of paradox to MJ's character. She seeks him out, and again proves she can be out of her shell around him, but ironically is fixated on a word designed to push other people away. MJ also proves herself as a resourceful and, more importantly, selfless person in small actions across the third act. I love that in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment, she puts together that Mysterio has targeted her, Ned, and Betty, and decides that they should peel off from the rest of the class for the sake of keeping everyone else safe. On a similar note, kudos to Happy for being willing to tank a bullet hell for these kids. So far I've only mentioned Happy disparagingly, but I really actually do like his presence in the movie. Action-wise, the movie does a good job showing an escalation from Homecoming. Peter in that film got to hold his own in a couple of fights, but Far From Home asks a lot more of him in terms of daring do. I love all the cool uses of the webs across the first two elemental fights, but the highlights for myself and so many others is the illusion sequence. It actually starts with that thing everyone was quick to complain about prior to this film's release, the Spidey sense. Peter realizes that Beck is in the room before any sign of him is made clear, which stops him from answering Fake Fury's questions of who he revealed the scheme to. And whether the following 5 minutes is all pre-planned for in advance by Beck or the result of creative moment-to-moment thinking, it speaks volumes about Beck as an intelligent threat that he ultimately gets what he wants, even though Peter is onto him fairly quick. I also like that the movie, intentionally or otherwise, uses the contrast of the overdone CG with the practical handheld feel of the exterior shots to its advantage. When Peter falls out of the building onto that car, and the CG is nowhere to be seen for a couple of seconds, it primes the audience to believe it when we see Fake Fury shoot Fake Beck at the end of the sequence, as things go back to practical exterior only for the rug to be pulled out from us and Peter one last time. It's a clever, subtle move nested in an already visually and narratively loaded action scene, which, hey, continues something that I haven't actually mentioned yet, that being the visual symbol of glass as related to the film's truth motif. It's something I really like about this movie, the consistent bit of visual storytelling throughout the whole film that I don't think it gets nearly enough credit for. Illusions and lies in this movie are heavily associated with glass and reflections, and the shattering of that glass comes to represent truth coming out. Obviously, this occurs all around Quentin Beck, to the point where the Mysterio outfit is basically just an extension of this symbol. Both in and out of his Mysterio costume, the guy spends a lot of time with his head inside of a glass sphere, which Peter breaks at the start of their final confrontation. Glass breaking around or trapping Peter happens all over the aforementioned illusion sequence. Heck, that sequence even starts with Peter and Fake Fury in a location with tons of glass and reflections to tip you off that something is wrong. At the end of the climax, after Peter has destroyed all of Beck's illusions and all of his internal illusions about himself, the scene is punctuated with Peter surrounded by tons and tons of broken glass. And finally, Peter gets a glass necklace for MJ, which shatters just as MJ decides to come completely clean about her feelings and shatter any illusions between the two of them. And you can now see even more why I think it would have been a thematically satisfying choice to destroy the pair of literal glasses that were a plot MacGuffin throughout the whole film. As far as the rest of the action goes, while the fights with the elementals certainly aren't disliked, the highlights for everyone are the Spidey v Mysterio confrontations. Not just the illusion sequence, but the climax. What I love about Peter's fight with the drones is how each major beat involves Peter being forced to get creative. The scene takes real advantage of how Peter is just bombarded from all sides with an overwhelming number of drones, and he has to pull out a different maneuver or trick almost every few seconds just to get the next wave off his back. The guy really can't afford to take a second of break time until it's all over and Beck is laid out. Even then, not really, as we end that scene with the incredibly somber note of Peter confirming that he has, even if indirectly, led to the death of someone. You can tell it's still bugging him, even in his otherwise heartwarming scene with MJ. And what better note to end things on than what's maybe the most game-changing end credits tag that any of these movies have ever had, with Peter having his identity revealed and being framed for Mysterio's crimes to the public. The ones who are more cynical about these films and the MCU in general are more dismissive of this development, worried the next film will simply toss the reveal and frame job on Peter under the rug, instead of hinging the plot around it. I'm much more optimistic. I really don't think anyone working on these films would toss away such a prime, only once-on-a-table opportunity for the kinds of stories you can tell in a sequel where the public knows Spidey's identity and is turned against him. They'd have to be insane to write themselves into such a pathos-filled, narratively impactful premise, several levels more so than even the reveal to Aunt May at the end of the last film, and then step back from it. Needless to say, I'll be more than a bit disappointed if we see trailers for the next film in this saga and haven't deviated heavily from the whimsical high school comedy tropes of the first two movies' marketing. Also, real missed opportunity if we don't bring J.K. Simmons and J. Jonah back in a major role next time after bringing him back for this. I choose to see this ending as a promise of great things to come, including a distancing from the forced levity this movie displayed at its weakest points. Overall, Far From Home is a very, very mixed bag in a nuts and bolts laid out on paper sort of way that I still personally think amounts to far more than the sum of its parts. The things about it that work so well that I have a blast every time I sit down with it and consider it a genuinely compelling story, with some of the best action and characterization and one of the best villains in a Spidey film, which are worth sitting through the overbearing gags and some really lame characterization choices, even if they don't stop them from being a shame to sit through. It's a really good movie with some really bad or questionable things in it, in short. Ugh, why do I get the feeling this video won't please anyone? So, that was a lot. But hey, I promised that Spider-Man-a-Thon would eventually catch up with the movies, and here we are. Let me know what you think about this movie and this video in the comments, like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already since that really helps me out, and stay tuned for the rest of this channel's content.